So today, let's see, we had a question come in from somebody just about SIBO. So I'm going to talk about
SIBO.
that. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about that. And then if anybody wants to ask any live questions, please do.
Let's get some.
So SIBO stands for small intestine bacterial overgrowth. If you haven't heard of that yet, it is a situation in which you have too much bacteria growing in your small intestine. It usually happens. There are a lot of reasons it can happen, but it usually happens as a result of something slowing down the motility in the small intestine. The small intestine is supposed to sweep itself out every night and in between meals. And so if it is unable to do that because it's moving too slowly, then bacteria tend to ferment the food that is in the small intestine, and then they set up shop there and they grow there when they really shouldn't. When digestion in general is working optimally, we have a lot of food breakdown in the mouth, and then a lot more food breakdown in the stomach, and then even more food breakdown in the small intestine. By the time it reaches the end of the small intestine, it should all be broken down into amino acids, simple sugars, and simple fats, fatty acids. And then all of that should get absorbed so that the bacteria don't eat so much of it. And then what we can't digest then passes on to the large intestine, where we let bacteria digest it there. So, like I said, there are a lot of things that can slow down motility in the small intestine. And so that is the thing that you want to look for and think about. And sometimes there's more than one thing, right? One of the things that can slow down small intestine motility is nervous system dysregulation. Yep. So there are definitely a lot of people who have gotten resolution of SIBO by addressing nervous system dysregulation, but it is not the only thing that can do that. So it pays to always take a broad lens and just go, okay, is there anything else glaringly standing out here that may be contributing? And if there is, then consider addressing that. So one of the things that I have learned working with a ton of SIBO patients and having had SIBO myself is that very, very often somebody has parasites and or fungal overgrowth that is actually contributing to the SIBO being there and making it so that they can't resolve it. So like 2/3 of SIBO cases are considered chronic if they don't respond to 1 or 2 rounds of antibiotic treatment or at herbal antimicrobials. Then the medical community just goes, oh, well, it's chronic. We don't know how to help you with that. And and sometimes they'll put you on these super restrictive diets and they'll just be like, this is all we have. Good luck. Enjoy that. And don't get me wrong, those diets, if you actually are on a track to eliminate SIBO, can be really beneficial short term. And it was part of what I did to get rid of my SIBO. However, being on a diet like that long term is not a good idea because it just results in nutritional deficiencies. There are just too many common foods taken out of that diet. And so I don't recommend anyone do it long term. But in the short term, if you are ready to eliminate, then it could be a good thing. But in order to eliminate, you have to find out what those things are that have been slowing down digestive motility. Some of the other really common ones are hypothyroidism. That one is pretty much epidemic in women over 30 and a lot of men too, but more so in women. So that's one to look for. There are some people who I've met who've had damage to the nerves in their enteric system. That can happen from a really virulent stomach bug sometimes, food poisoning in particular. That can happen from autoimmune conditions that damage the gut lining. That can happen from mycotoxins that damage the gut lining. That's extremely common.
Mycotoxins.
MS.
Mycotoxins
MS is a
means
common. Yeah.
mycotoxins means mold, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So one of the things that has emerged in the alternative or functional medicine community who pays attention to root causes is that an enormous percentage of SIBO cases that are unresolving because of mold. And I think, the same could probably be said for nervous system dysregulation. These are like two areas of medicine where people fall through the cracks constantly, and the actual root cause is not determined for a really long time. So look for that early, because I have had many, many patients who have worked really hard at eliminating SIBO. And when they finally figure out they have mold and address it, then they're able to get rid of the SIBO, and it's really not hard. And that's what happened for me too. I basically was living in mold, didn't know it. That is when SIBO developed for me. I was also really, really dysregulated at the same time. And I had parasites. I probably had parasites for a decade. When I look back at my bowel history, I'm pretty sure I know when I got parasites. So I worked on all three at the same time. Once I figured out they were all going on, it just happened to be like this perfect storm. And I addressed the fungus in my gut, which means killed it, killed the parasites in my gut, addressed nervous system dysregulation, and then boom, getting rid of SIBO was like piece of cake. But it took me 6 years to get to that point where I was like, oh, these are all the things that are doing it, and had a route to remedy that. Addressing mold sometimes takes a good bit of time, depending on whether you are just going to leave the place you're in that's moldy or you're going to remediate it, right? So, having some patience is important if this is the condition you're dealing with.
Just to clarify, Karen, it took you 6 years to figure out why you had SIBO?
Yes.
Okay. Not it took you 6 years once you found out to clear it. I just want to make sure people didn't, because I was like, it's not going to take that long.
No.
It might take a while.
It took me a couple of years because I couldn't move. It was just really bad timing for us to make a move. And it was like middle of the pandemic, I think, when we were like, oh, wow, this mold situation is worse than we thought. And we were like, oh, yeah, we're not going to move. So to remediate just took time. It's important to know that this may be a process for you. If mold illness is part of what you're dealing with, that it may take some time. And the best thing you can do for yourself during that waiting period is to keep yourself calm, to keep working on your nervous system, because it's going to be likely stressful. It's likely going to be a little bit traumatic for some people. A lot of times you have to get rid of some of your favorite possessions that may be too moldy to. It's really hard. It's not an easy journey, but if you address your emotions and your nervous system throughout the journey, it will be dramatically easier, I promise. So, yeah. And of course, you are helping your digestive tract as you do that. It may not be enough to eradicate SIBO, but it may be enough to reduce the symptoms a good bit just by improving your digestion as much as you can through the nervous system. Somebody asked in the chat, how did I actually get rid of it? And that's a great question. I'm glad you asked, because this is something I want everyone to know about, and it's not very well known yet. So I discovered this book by a naturopath whose practices in Washington, and it was all about the super unconventional approach to resolving SIBO that she stumbled across herself. And she had SIBO, and she was like, none of these things that people are telling me to do are working. What's the deal? And she just happened to be talking to a compounding pharmacy about it. And they were like, oh, well, have you tried MSM? Methylsulfonyl methane is a sulfur donor, and it is antimicrobial as well. And so she tried it, and she ended up getting rid of her own SIBO that way, and then went on to do that with a lot of other patients. Fast forward 20 years, she eventually wrote a book about it. By that point, SIBO was really well known. Back when she discovered this, like, nobody even knew what it was. So she just had all the classic symptoms. So anyways, she developed her own supplement that basically has MSM, marshmallow, slippery elm, and acacia fiber, which is the only fiber that is safe to use if you have SIBO. And that particular supplement was doing gangbusters for all her SIBO patients, was just amazing. And it's a completely different approach to healing SIBO. Most of the approaches out there are kill it or starve it. And this one is doing that. The MSM is killing. However, it is also repairing the gut lining. So this is her whole theory about why people end up in the realm of chronic SIBO. She also acknowledges things like mold and parasites are common contributors. Other than that, she's like, If the gut lining is really damaged, then it's not going to be producing all those what they call brush border enzymes. The small intestine has this kind of furry looking brush border to it. And that border of those cells produces a bunch of enzymes that does the final stage of breakdown of your food. So you got stomach acid first, and then you got pancreatic enzymes next, and then you got brush border enzymes. So this is the last step that gets you to amino acids and fatty acids. And so once you've got those little building blocks, then those can go across the small intestine lining and get absorbed and used for fuel. But when they're bigger than that, they shouldn't get across the gut lining, but they might anyway and start to cause food intolerances, which is a common thing that goes along with SIBO, not just FODMAPs intolerance, which is normal with SIBO, but also other food intolerances often come along with it. So her approach was heal the gut lining so you can fully break down that food. It doesn't ferment anymore. And then, the SIBO will resolve. And that does seem to be what is happening. So she wrote a book called GI Janelle, where she talks in depth about how this approach to curing SIBO works.
G.I.Janel.
Yeah.
Like G.I. Jane.
Yes, with an L on the end. Yeah. So since I discovered it and used it for myself, I've recommended it to a bunch of people, and they've all had dramatically better success with it than they had with traditional approaches. That being said, the one other person for whom it didn't work right away was somebody who had both parasites and fungal overgrowth in their digestive tract. So once I helped that person with that, then they were able to get rid of it with GI Janelle. So, yes, I hope that helps some of you out there who are struggling with that. And I do think you are in the right place in terms of, addressing your nervous system as part of what may be contributing to the dysfunction in your gut, but don't ignore the other things that could be playing a role too, some of those common ones I mentioned. Any follow-up questions about that? Oh, somebody also asked about how I got rid of parasites. So I talk about this in the Curatin method section where I go over infections, but parasites are not one that I see people's bodies clear very easily on their own once the infection gets established. Yes, we do take in small amounts of parasites on our food that our body can sort of flush out oftentimes if it's just a little bit. But if you get a significant dose, it's likely that some of those parasites are going to hang around and start multiplying. So whether it's microscopic or macroscopic, I would say maybe 25% of the time, I've been able to get rid of those infections with herbs. 75% of the time, I've had to use a drug to get rid of them. And with the type of practice that I was running, where I was doing a specific type of muscle testing that was super accurate, I could find out if somebody actually got rid of it or not. And it's tricky with parasites because they have this life cycle that lasts like 4 to 6 weeks or something, depends on the parasite. So symptoms also cycle. Usually people who have parasites will have flares of symptoms around the full moon or the new moon or both. So they'll have periods of time where they're like, oh, maybe it went away. Maybe I'm fine. Sometimes that's how it presents. Sometimes the infection's so severe that you're just having symptoms every day. I think that's an important thing for people to know, because when I went into practice, I was really, I'm coming from a naturopathic background. I wanted to do everything naturally. So I tried with many people, including myself, but I was literally on herbal antiparasitics for years, and it didn't get rid of my parasites. I've had a number of patients who've walked that journey as well. So, the antiparasitic drugs are actually not very dangerous. They don't typically cause insane side effects except for digestive, right? Which makes sense because you are killing things in your digestive tract. They are dying, and that's causing inflammation. So it's very common when you're on one of them to have some digestive distress, whether it be bloating or cramping or changes to your bowel movements or stuff like that. But for the most part, they're pretty safe drugs, and most people tolerate them pretty well. However, if you are a hypersensitive person, to supplements, medications, etc., then you want to be very careful. And starting with herbs may be a good way to go because you can lower the load of the parasites. And then you can start a drug. Then you'll have less die off when you're on the drug. So less chance of having side effects of the die off. So that's one way you could go about that if you
That's
are
super
super
smart.
sensitive. Yeah, I also think that if you are super sensitive, doing more of this nervous system regulation before you try something that you think you may react poorly to, you're almost certainly going to react better to it if you do some of this regulation work first. So, I mean, overall regulating your nervous system better, but also specifically reducing your own fear of having a reaction, right? And we've talked about that on a number of these Q&A calls, how you can do that. Just to reiterate that, you know, if you think about like taking a particular treatment and it causes a stress response for you, or you get really anxious, or you feel afraid, or you get really upset and you're like, I shouldn't have to take, I don't want to ever take drugs. I shouldn't have to do this. You know, some of us have that little resistant voice inside. Whatever comes up, if it's not, yeah, it's going to be okay. Yeah, I'm going to do that. It's going to be fine. If it's not something like that, then you probably want to take that to a process, dance process, feathering, a parts work, or pattern interrupt. And then work your number down the scale all the way to a 0 before you even consider trying that drug. But even after you get it to a 0, one thing you can do to even improve your results further is close your eyes, imagine yourself taking the drug and just feeling better and better and better every day you take it, right? The best case scenario outcome. And practice that every day until you actually end up taking it. And that will help your brain go into it feeling safer with what you're going to do. And therefore, it's less likely for your subconscious to produce a reaction, right? As we know, we can have reactions to any kind of treatment because the body's just reacting, right? Like, oh, you have an allergy to that drug, or, you know, it causes some inflammation in your stomach lining, like a ibuprofen or something, right? That's one type of reaction you can have. But you can also have a reaction to the drug or treatment of any kind. It doesn't have to be a drug, could be a manual therapy, just because your subconscious has tagged that as unsafe. Right? From either a past experience you've had with it or a story you heard, right? It's always based on your past experiences. So if you are carrying with you a memory of your mother taking certain drugs for her health and it just like demolishing her, just making her feel like terrible, right? That can be an imprint that can then make you afraid to take drugs. Or maybe you grew up in a family where, an example, my grandmother was a Christian Scientist and they don't believe in medicine. Like, they don't go to the doctor. That's not a thing. And you don't take drugs. You just don't do that. Right? You only put food and drinks into your body. That's it. And so they have the belief system that medicine is not a good thing. In some cases, some people believe it's dangerous and it's like working against God, something like that. And so for somebody like my grandmother, taking medication was super scary for her. And it was something she'd never done in her life up until old age. And she had a really hard time with it when she did end up taking some medication at the end. So those kinds of things can be rewired. You don't have to just push through the fear. I don't suggest that you do, because you probably will have a much more uncomfortable time with it, not just mentally and emotionally, but in your body. Your subconscious is likely to produce something in your body to try to deter you from doing whatever that is. Okay, sorry, I just rambled a really long time. Anybody want to add anything or ask anything?
What? If that's rambling, ramble on. Uh,
Thank you.
yeah, I mean, it is such an important compliment, right? Like I tell people all the time, a huge part of why it was so important to have you be part of Wired for Wellness is because you know how to address, like, you can't brain train away your parasites. Like, it's,
yeah,
it's just,
that's just not what I've seen. Nope.
And I know for me, I got a lot better in a lot of different ways using brain training, and I just could not get the last
Mm-hmm.
bit, it was just like, this is not moving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just not moving. It's not moving. And I did need some support to help kill parasites and maybe some fungal stuff and clear some other things out of my system.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm doing a lot better. So it was like my body needed some help to be able to kill those suckers. I traveled abroad a couple times when I was in my early 20s, and a few years after that was when my symptoms started to kick in real hard. And
Yeah.
so it's probably a little perfect storm of a bunch of different things that happened around that time.
Yeah.
And it's so counter to the narrative that all of the medical practitioners and functional medicine doctors had told me over the years. None of it had gotten the job done because I think it needed both, right? And so this thing, even if people are aware of MSM and getting rid of mold and all these other things, if their nervous system is still really dysregulated, it's going to be, I don't know if it'll take a lot more time to clear out the mold of your system. Like the body just
Yes.
doesn't have the resources it needs because
Yes.
it's burning through everything to handle stress.
Yes.
So yeah, that's
100%.
pretty darn important what we're talking about, and enough of a reason that you're like, I need to go do this full time.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is the piece that most people miss, right? Most people are like addressing the physical to the nines, but they just don't even give any credit to what their nervous system is doing.
Yeah.
But in some cases, I get people who are like, they've come from other frameworks of brain training where it's implied that you can achieve anything with brain training. That I just don't think is a reality all the time. And I think it makes people feel like a failure when they brain train really hard and, they only get part of the way there and they're like, well, what's wrong with me? And it's like,
That was me.
there's nothing
So
wrong with you.
I did something where I brain trained and I was feeling better. And then I was like, I had cut gluten out of my diet because I was living like off of no food, like just nothing. I was reacting to everything. And
Yeah.
I had gotten better. And so I was like, I am brain trained. I'm better. And I'm going to start eating gluten like crazy. And it turns out that my genes say, nope, I'm like
Mm.
practically celiac. It's not something that my body can tolerate genetically. We can shift some things, but we also can't really brain train our genetics.
You can change things epigenetically, right?
Yeah. But this was
Yeah.
my like hardcore genetic code. So,
Yep.
and I had to just come to terms with like, that was that. But because I did that and I started eating all this gluten, I started getting all these symptoms and, anemia, like all it just blew up my health. I hadn't eaten gluten in like 15 years. And I was like, I'm better because I brain trained and I had seen so many results in all these other parts of my life. And I was feeling better. I was more able to eat different foods. And so I just started eating it. And 6 months later, I was like, why can't I get up off the ground?
Yeah.
Without
I mean, it's super cool that
being
you
like,
weren't reacting to it anymore, right?
no,
You
I
didn't feel
wasn't.
bad when you ate it.
Nope.
And so, just to be clear for people, if you brain train for a bunch of different foods that you're sensitive to and you no longer have any kind of reaction to them when you eat them, first of all, check that for 72 hours after you eat the food. A lot of people don't realize a reaction can occur anytime in that period after eating it. If it's a true IgG food sensitivity, it's a certain type of antibody reaction to the food. Secondarily, I don't see foods other than gluten cause that issue where you feel like you're fine with it, but it's actually causing a bunch of damage. So I think with other foods,
Chowing down
you're probably good to
burritos
go
and
with just
pizza.
eating it again. Yeah, if you're feeling good when you're eating it. And some people absolutely do get gluten back into their diet because they don't have the genetics for celiac or for gluten sensitivity.
Yeah.
And so some people actually are fine with eating gluten again. So it's nice to have a little bit deeper information with that one if you're going to go back to eating gluten. But with everything else, you should be fine to go back to eating it. How did we test for those things? The test for the gluten sensitivity genetics. I haven't done that test in a long time. I think that Entero Labs is the one that I used to use for that. The celiac testing, you can just get through regular lab. Any doctor can order that for you, MD, PCP, anybody through Quest or LabCorp or any of those common labs. So those are super easy to do. A lot of people miss having celiac because they go gluten-free before they do the testing. That's not a good idea.
Oh.
So the celiac testing via blood is measuring antibodies. So you are not going to have positive antibodies if you haven't eaten gluten recently. So you actually want to do the testing before you go gluten free, which is hard for some people if they're having really intense symptoms from it, but
Okay.
it's a really good idea because celiac requires you to dramatically change your life. So you want to have proof that that's what it is, because it's not like, oh yeah, I'll just go to this restaurant that serves glutinous bread and pasta and makes it in house, but I'll have the thing on the menu that's gluten free. That's not a thing with celiac. You go to places where they have dedicated kitchen space for gluten free, or the whole kitchen's gluten free, something like that. So it's dramatic. So you want to find out beforehand. So you need to eat gluten in the 6 weeks before you do the testing, any kind of testing. The other gold standard testing for celiac is to get an endoscopy and to get some samples taken from your small intestine lining to show that there has been blunting of that brush border I was talking about earlier. So basically, celiac disease causes all those little furry ends on those cells to just get cut off, basically, get damaged. As far as the other tests, parasites and fungus, I talk about this in the Curitin method section of the course too. But with parasites, they're really hard to pick up on tests, really, really hard. And so I have played with a lot of different labs over the years. I have found GI Map picks them up sometimes. That's by Diagnostic Solutions. They're in Atlanta, Georgia. That lab does DNA testing for a couple handfuls, like 2 handfuls maybe, of parasites that you could have, both microscopic and macroscopic. But by no means do they test for all of them. And because of the way they're testing, and they're testing for very specific ones, you can very easily miss if you have one of the other ones. So that's a huge downside to that one. But even with that test, even though it's a DNA test, which is more sensitive than when they look under the microscope at your poop for parasites, you can still miss them because parasites shed in the stool intermittently. Because of their life cycle, they're not always coming out in the stool. And so for that test, you only collect one stool sample, so you may or may not pick it up. But it's one of the better ones. The other one that is a better one is Parawellness, which that lab is cool because you can order it for yourself. I think their website's like parawellness.com or something. And the guy that runs the lab is a parasitologist for over 30 years. I think maybe over 40 now. He's really, really good at identifying them in the stool. And so he never misses microscopic parasites if they're in there. And he's really good at picking up yeast as well. So that is a microscopic test. He's looking at every single poop sample, this parasitologist. He doesn't hire other people to do it. So it takes like 4 to 6 weeks to get results. That's because he knows it's really hard to train someone to be good to find parasites in the stool. That's why those tests at Quest and LabCorp that called O&P times 3, those are worthless. They're
Okay. Okay.
like, just don't even waste your time. They
All right.
never find parasites.
Oh,
Um, so maybe if somebody's like immunocompromised and they're just full of parasites, but like the average person, no, never going to pick it up. So don't bother. Parawellness is like $350 last time I checked. The downside to Parawellness is that he isn't able to pick up worms a lot of the time because worms shed more intermittently in the stool than the protozoa do. So one poop sample, he's probably going to miss it a lot of the time, probably like 90% of the time. So I picked up parasites on my patients by using ART, autonomic response testing. Many of them wanted to do this conventional testing, and sometimes that testing would confirm the parasitic infection. However, what I would say to them is, look, in alternative medicine and functional medicine, it is actually the standard to presumptively treat if you suspect parasites because they're so hard to find on testing. Not all doctors are comfortable with doing that, but It is common in our field because we just know that we're going to miss it a lot of the time. So if you do a treatment trial with parasitic medication, which only really targets parasites, then you get very good information out of that trial. You will get a sign that you have parasites if you take one of those medications. You will either feel really crummy from the die off when you're on it, or you will feel a lot better as time goes on it.
Mm.
If either of those things happen, you get confirmation that, yes, there are some parasites playing a role. And so that's what I would do. So I would tell them when we'd find it on ART, if they were like, well, I don't know, is that really accurate? I found it to be extremely accurate. Without fail, when people would start taking the medication, it would be very clear that they needed the medication.
Yeah.
So that's also how, I identified that I had worms and probably had for many, many years.
You know, I have to tell you, Karen, when you told me about the fact that I could just treat, like there's entire countries where once or twice a year they just take these anti-parasitic
Yeah.
medications
Yeah.
because they're so safe.
Hmm.
And it's just assumed because of where they are and because it's so prevalent
Yeah.
for people to have those infections, they just take it.
Yeah.
I was like, and it costs almost nothing. They're super cheap. They're super safe. They've been around forever. And like, you're cool with saying take it. And you're not really cool with just saying just take anything. So I was kind of frustrated when I heard like, well, why wouldn't I take the thing that's like under $30 or under $20 or something that would just get the job done instead of going and spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on possibly ineffective testing to then take the same treatment. And I was just like, oh, okay. So I just thought that was brilliant when you told me that. And I was also very frustrated. It's probably one of the things that super wrecked my gut when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah.
Along with eating a mostly gluten diet. But anyway, those two things all came together. It really affected my life. And the fact that they don't just say, oh, go ahead and just do this like a large percentage of the world does.
Yeah. But conventional docs in the US do not, like, ever. That's because in the US, the AMA, the American Medical Association, says, oh, yeah, ONP times 3 is accurate. So don't treat if you don't find the parasite. We know that it's inaccurate, but unfortunately the AMA is really behind the times on research in so many areas, like a ton of areas in medicine.
Nervous system stimulation.
Yeah. It takes like decades for them to change anything about their policies, and they're very punitive. So conventional docs, if they do things that are outside of the AMA quote standard of care, can lose their licenses, and it can be very serious, even if they were really doing what was in the best interest of the patient, but it's not following the AMA's rules.
Yeah.
So that's why, in order to find anyone that would consider doing treatment for you without a positive parasite test, you really will have to go towards functional or alternative providers. Mm-hmm. Fungus is the same. Fungus, other than yeast, is very hard to test for in the stool. It can live, like environmental mold species can live in your sinuses, in your lungs, and in your digestive tract. And they can hang out there and make toxins, mycotoxins inside your body. Isn't that nice? They like those spaces. They're nice and dark and damp, and they've got plenty of food. So they love, and both parasites and fungus can live in the body for years, decades, your whole life. Basically, like they can take just enough that they need to live for themselves and not kill you. And your immune system can keep them semi under control, but usually can't get rid of them once they've gotten really, really established, like on their own, usually can't. Which is why if you look at indigenous cultures, especially in the tropics and any part of this world, they are taking anti-parasitic and antifungal herbs on a regular basis. So, maybe 4 times a year or something like that. They're doing an intensive course of something like that. And that's really, really common in indigenous medicine anywhere, because they know, these things are going to set up shop and cause us problems if we don't do this. So that's what I saw going on in the Amazon when I spent a bunch of time in South America learning from some of the indigenous healers down there. And they were like, yeah, this is what we do. And we give it to all the white people that come down here too. All the people from all over the world, they're just like, we know you guys have it too. We just give it to you too. And they're right. In my practice, like at least 50% of my patients had parasites at some point in our journey of working together, had worms or had protozoa. And for many of them was part of why they were chronically sick. Fungus can be the same way because it can live there for years. So sometimes people can have like a really bad mold exposure like a long time ago, and that mold sets up shop in their sinuses and they leave that environment, but the mold's still living in there. So it's still causing them increased allergies. It's still causing them brain fog. It's still causing them headaches, potentially, things like that, congestion. It's actually not common for mold in the sinuses to cause sneezing. That's very uncommon, but it can worsen your allergies to other substances and typically does. And so then you may be sneezing to those things, but that's not usually the chronic symptom you'll have from mold in your sinuses. So anyways, we were talking about testing. Well, it's hard to test for. For some people, they carry it somewhat silently, like they don't have massive symptoms from it. Other people have migraines and severe headaches. And for me, that's how it presented. I just had basically a chronic headache for years, and it was sinus, right? So it would start at the bridge of my nose and then balloon out to all these other parts of my head.
So you could have reduced that with brain training, but really eliminating it.
Yeah. I had to kill the fungus. Yeah.
This is why we have the Curitin method in the program in there. It is a balancing game. We do prioritize talking about the nervous system stuff because it's something that's just so important to be doing. There's a reason why we don't have you start with a medical conversation in the program, which is that that's the world you've been swimming in. And it could be that, like for me, I got a dramatic reduction in symptoms. I had a big improvement to the point where I was like, I guess I can eat everything.
Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't the world's greatest idea for me, but
I mean, it just lays the foundation, right?
Yeah.
The foundation for your immune system, the foundation for your digestive system, every system in your body. Having a regulated nervous system is the foundation for it working properly, right? So if you don't want to be dependent on medications and supplements, then this is a really important thing to address. And most people need to address it first because they are so dysregulated by the conversation that is medical. So when they even think about having parasites, they get so freaked out that it makes them sort of shut down or not want to take action or something, or they get hyper obsessed with it and it's all they can think about. And none of those things are good things, right? As we go through the medical pieces, also maintain regulation for best results.
Oh my gosh. I just remember every time I went in there, I was just like, they're going to charge me thousands of dollars and I'm going to get tested and it's not going to work again. I'm just going to keep being sick. I was so frustrated and I would sit in there. Oh,
yeah.
It was so like freaking frustrating. Yeah. So anyone that's going through that, we really get it. And so it's one of the reasons why if you're able to do this, to be prepped and to have, the education that's in the Curitin method, if you do want to go through and listen, it's ridiculously comprehensive. It's probably worth a couple $1,000s on its own, honestly. Over time, we'll be adding more and more to it. If you have specific questions, I'm sure we can address them here. This one is kind of a big one. And, folks haven't had a chance to go through the process of listening to all that medical content. You can do it there.
Carrie, you can unmute yourself and let us know what you want to say.
I want to see if I'm hearing this correctly. So it's so hard to test for some of these things, specifically fungus and parasites, that often the test is taking the medication. And if you have a positive result, then that's what it is. I've never really had digestive issues ever in my life, but coming off something from April that was an emergency situation has left me, it's been disrupted in some way. So my question is, do you do these things simultaneously, or do you parse apart, okay, this period of time I'm doing this fungus treatment, and then if I'm better, then I'll do the parasite treatment because that could be part of it, or how does that look?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It depends on who you're working with and how they like to function. But if you are doing presumptive treatment and you don't have any kind of test result to back that up, then it is a good idea to start one at a time. And it doesn't mean that you can't stack the two treatments on top of each other if you're dealing with both parasites and fungus, but it means that you want to test each new treatment on its own, make sure you're tolerating it and that it's either giving you a positive result or it's giving you side effects suggesting that you have that thing before you add the next thing. And if it's giving you side effects, you probably don't want to add the next thing yet, right? Because you don't want to make yourself feel crummier potentially from too much die-off. Oftentimes, if you've got a lot of different chronic infections, if you try to address them all at once, you often feel quite crummy because the die-off just causes so much inflammation. And we call this a Herx reaction. It's the same feeling as having like a flu, right? Oftentimes just you feel tired, you feel achy, and you feel brain fogged and unmotivated. Your tummy might be all messed up. Those are common effects if you're killing a lot all at once. And it depends on where you're killing things. If you're killing things in the sinuses, you're more likely to have headaches and brain fog. If you're killing things in the digestive tract, you're more likely to have bloating or cramping or diarrhea. So what I would do, because I could use ART in my practice, I would get all the answers at once, at least whatever the body was saying it was ready to work on. That's what we would get in the muscle testing at that time. And if the body said parasites and fungus, then I would treat both. But I would usually have people start each thing individually, especially if I'm using medication. With fungus, you can be successful with herbs alone. However, I would usually use both personally. I would usually use medication and herbs because it speeds it up dramatically. And those medications also are really safe, especially nystatin. Like nystatin just stays in the digestive tract itself. It doesn't become systemic, doesn't have a big impact on the liver. And so it's a nice adjunct. And I would usually use it with herbs. All of these organisms can become resistant to whatever you're using, whether it's a single herb or it's a single medication. So always keep that in mind. Many times it's really, really helpful to do more than one thing at the same time, particularly pairing a medication with an herb. That usually works really well and doesn't cause, interactions. It's pretty rare, actually. There are only a few herbs where we really worry about really dramatic interactions with medications. Most herbs, we don't really have to worry about it. That's just something to keep in mind. It's always good for your practitioner to check for interactions, but most of the time you don't have to worry about that with the antifungal and antiparasitic herbs and medications.
And do those things impact other medications that people take? If you're on a statin or if you're on a hormonal treatment or something like that, do those things, I know sometimes when things are sped through or slowed down in the digestive tract, you can have issues with absorption of other medications, and just wondering about
Yeah, you always have to check for interactions if somebody's on other medications. Not a whole lot of my patients were on a lot of other meds, but if they were, I would always check interactions before I started a antifungal or antiparasitic medication just to be sure. The most common thing that is likely to happen with herbs or medications, some herbs, because of they may go through the same enzyme in the liver as a medication, they may either slow down or speed up that enzyme function. And so that then may impact how quickly the medication is processed in the body and how much of it sticks around and for how long. So that can cause potential side effects or issues, just depending. But funny enough, you can have that same thing from an environmental toxin. So as an example, when I was super mold toxic, I realized that the mycotoxins were slowing down my elimination of estrogen. So I had never been estrogen dominant in my life up until that point. Then I was listening to some lecture about mold, and the person was talking about which CYP enzymes and other pathways and things the estrogen and certain mycotoxins were going through. And it was like, oh yeah, these things conflict. They're going through the same pathway. And therefore, it is common that somebody may have a backup of estrogen if they're dealing with this mycotoxin. And that's absolutely what happened for me. And as soon as I got all the mycotoxins out of my body, my hormones rebalanced and I just didn't have to deal with that anymore. The high estrogen just went away. So yeah, I hope that clarifies that very complicated topic a little bit.
The thing that I took from working with Karen and our conversations as a very lay person.
That's good. Share it with us.
Yeah, I was like, this ART thing that Karen does. I had a number of experiences with muscle testing processes in the past because I was trying everything. Man, I've been trying everything. Yeah, I tried everything. That's what it felt like. I didn't literally try everything, but I felt like I was trying a lot. And muscle testing is in that world. One summer I had gone and had like 3 different muscle testing practitioners test me out because I was traveling and I wanted to keep refining my supplements, and they all contradicted each other. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what am I even doing? What am I paying for? Like, what am I buying into here? And I told that to Karen. I was like, Karen, I had this crappy experience with muscle testing and I'm not a big fan. Mm-hmm. And she agreed with me and then proceeded to say, but I've used this muscle testing and confirmed a lot of it with, it's different. And there's no remote. I have to actually go be in person to do the testing and stuff like that. And so it's just a thought. If you're able to use an ART practitioner, especially one that we have vetted and recommend, or if you find one that, if you do want us to check and see if they really have the test kits and things that are necessary to accomplish what's necessary, if you want to contact us, we're looking to grow our network of referral ART practitioners. But that might be a consideration to go ahead and even travel to get that ART testing done. Given how much testing costs in general, it might be like, yeah, you could take a trip to Portland and enjoy yourself in the city for a day or two, get all your ART testing done, and still maybe come out spending less than doing a lot of medical testing, or do it in complement, do it together with it. That seemed to really get the job done for me, and Karen had really great success using it in her practice. And so I'm happy with the results of it. And as someone who was very skeptical of muscle testing because direct experiences I'd had with it in the past, this time it got the job done.
Yeah. I mean, what I told Tamara about it, and, my journey with it was similar in that when I was in school, I was exposed to a lot of different types of muscle testing. They don't teach that at my school, but a lot of people were learning it on the side. And so I would let them practice on me and I would try it out and stuff like that. And, I was just curious. I was like, let me just see. And I had the same experience where results were inconsistent and varied from practitioner to practitioner. And I was like, well, no, I can't stand behind that. Never. And then right after I graduated, I started getting in touch with a lot of people that I wanted to mentor with. And all of them were doing this ART testing. And they were like, yeah, like I could not treat complex chronically ill patients without this. I mean, it would just take so much longer. It'd probably take 4 years to get them well instead of 1.5. And they were like, and it would cost them a lot more money too. And I was like, okay, well, let's try this out. And so I went and did the training, and then I got some mentoring in it, and I just started doing it on people, and then having somebody else that knew how to do it on the same person. And I wouldn't tell them my results and they wouldn't tell me their results until it was all over. Then we would compare notes. And then I started doing it on patients and being like, well, the muscle testing says this, but let's validate it with a lab test. And then we would start doing the same lab, and that would validate the results. And so I did a lot of sort of my own experimentation testing to validate it and to make sure that it was accurate. And that's the only reason I used it in my practice. And it did save people thousands of dollars, because the testing for this kind of stuff, for tick-borne infections and parasites and all that stuff costs a fortune. It costs a lot, hundreds of dollars for every single
No,
test.
I used to drop every time I went to the functional medicine doctor at least 3 grand. I think once it was $5,000 on testing.
Yeah,
I
it's
didn't,
insane.
and they were like, "You look fine," and I'm like, "Everything I eat makes me sick." I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know how many things is poop and blood and saliva, like everything. And one thing that she told me, like with the ART for parasites, she'd have me come at the full moon. Never heard of that. I got some blood work, so she'd have me do it at a certain time of the month. None of those other functional medicine people who were like rated very, very highly in functional medicine land were doing any of that stuff. And they didn't get me better. I also didn't have the regulation in my system. They also didn't know about regulation. And,
Right.
and so even though they're better than conventional doctors who would just tell me it was all in my head, which I was like, oh, that's not productive. That's not actionable. And it's not helpful. But anyways,
Right. Especially not for $5,000. Can you give me a little bit more?
yeah. All right. Yeah. I really appreciate that ART exists. I don't understand it. It's weird to me and it gets the job done. And that's all I really care about. You know me, I love results. So
Yeah. That's why I do it too. I don't like being that weirdo that does muscle testing, but I am because I'm married to what works. I don't care if it's weird. I'm just like, does it work? Does it not work? So that's my 2 cents. But I don't think I finished my thought about testing for fungus. So I'm going to do that really quick. Environmental molds in the stool, there is no test for that right now. There is a new one that came out that may work for that, but I haven't had a chance to test it yet. It's basically one that sequences all of the bacterial and fungal DNA that comes out in the stool. So it's not just looking for specific species, it's just sequencing whatever's there. So that's a really cool test. And they are doing it with fungi, which is new. This has been out for bacteria for a long time in the intestines, but not for fungus. So we'll see how that one develops. It was literally launching this year. So it's very new. We just don't have enough information yet. As far as any of the other stool companies out there, none of them are testing for environmental molds. So you just need to know that. And I think if you've been living in mold for a significant period of time, that is one of those things you treat presumptively. And if you read for any of the material being put out by the experts in that field, like Neil Nathan and Jill Krista and people like that, you will hear them say that too. They're just like, yeah, we just assume that it's growing in people's intestines and we just treat it. Same for the sinuses. There is a company who claims to be able to pick up fungus in the sinuses called Microbiology DX. They've had a swab for the sinuses for a long time, but I have used that test a lot and
why?
it does not actually pick up a lot of fungi. Yes.
Pills.
Yes. Yes. So I always ask people when they're like, I have migraines and I have headaches. I'm like, well, what is the pattern of the headache? What does it look like? Where is it? What does it feel like, et cetera? Because, I just talked to somebody the other day who was like, I have migraines. And she was like, I've been diagnosed with them and I have this migraine medication. I'm like, well, are they classic? Are they one-sided? What are they like? And she was like, oh no, that's my whole head feels like it's going to explode. And then it hurts a lot behind one eye. And I tend to get congested when it happens. And it's very intermittent. I can't figure out why it sometimes happens and it seems to be random. And I was like, well, that sounds like it might be a mold headache. There's this interesting phenomenon with mold where if you have it growing in your body and then you go somewhere where there is mold. So this person in particular who I'm talking about, she has remediated her home. Her home is now low mold, mold-free, like good environment for her, but she hasn't dealt with it in her body yet. And this is what happened to me when you have it growing in your body and you go somewhere that is moldy when your typical environment is not. Those molds, you inhale them, right? Whatever's in the environment comes in, you inhale it. And molds are competitive. They want the same resources. And so when they sense another species is there, they put on their defenses and they say, oh, let's go. They're like, we're here. We're not letting you in. And the way that they fight is they fight with mycotoxins.
Oh, that's crazy.
That is the purpose of mycotoxins, is to kill other fungi.
What?
So when you go into an environment that's moldy, then those fungi start fighting and they fight with chemical warfare in your face. or in your digestive tract, wherever they are. And that will typically make your symptoms a lot worse temporarily.
Oh, you just have to laugh.
Yeah, that's just such a funny world. Yeah.
It's a funny world. I mean,
The microscopic world.
oh,
It's not that different from the macroscopic.
the experience of that is terrible. And what the heck? That is just high comedy.
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
It is my plan and my goal to put together a list of my favorite tools and resources for dealing with different health issues, because some of them are super innocuous, very safe for you to use on your own if you know you're dealing with a certain thing. They're just very, very benign, right? Like I had this probiotic for my sinuses that I used to help get rid of the fungus in my sinuses. And like, that's not going to hurt anybody, right? So those are the kinds of things I'm going to share with you guys over time. I'm going to put it in the Curitin method, and I've started the list, but I've got a long way to go.
You're basically creating a naturopathic physician in a box.
Yeah.
Or in a course. Like it's kind of wild to,
Yeah.
Apparently you don't need to go to naturopathic physician school.
Yeah, I'll give you guys the cheat sheet. I'll give you the cliff notes of school.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're just really wanting to empower people to go and have more resourced conversations. It's like going into the mechanic with my car and I don't know anything. They can tell me that it's, all this and that and whatever. And I'm just like, well, okay, here you go. I just have to trust them. It's the same thing with medical practitioners and dentists and, just lawyers. I mean, so many things where we just have to trust an expert. And it definitely makes a difference to have a little bit of
more knowledge base.
More knowledge. Yeah. Before doing anything in life, especially when it's going to be something as important as your health and the amount of financial investment we put into getting well if we're chronically ill.
Should probably wrap this up for today. Thanks, guys, for listening to the Karen and Tamara show again this week. As always, please submit some questions so we have things to talk about next week, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Bye.
Okay, ciao, everybody.